Okay. Are we ready?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's seminar presentation. Our speaker is Dr. Obadele Akan. Now, for those of you who don't know him, he received his PhD in linguistics from this department. How many months ago?
I graduated in June, but they counted for December 2012.
So he graduated, so he got his PhD from this December 2012. So brand new, fresh. Yeah. There are others in the pipeline, but he's the freshest so far. And it will interest you to know that Dr. Campbell first came to Ghana somewhere in 96 on the CIE program and learned Twi here. Went back and graduated at Morehouse College, one of the famous black colleges in Atlanta, the US. Did his MA in University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then applied to come back here to this PhD. Now, this man speaks, apart from English, he speaks Akan, Twi, he speaks Yoruba, and Wolof, some Kiswahili. So he is a linguist. And today he's going to talk about reconstruction, as towards a reconstruction of the C1 of Proto-Benue-Kwa, evidence from Akan and Yoruba. Dr. Campbell, you have 40 minutes to present, and then you leave 20 minutes for questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Obadele Campbell.
Okay, as mentioned, today I will be working on recurrent sound correspondences and providing evidence from Akan and Yoruba and moving towards Proto-Benue-Kwa C1 Reconstruction. So first, the aim and purpose. This study addresses the implications of lexical cognates and regular sound correspondences in the basic vocabulary of Akan, Twi, and Yoruba with regard to reconstruction of Proto-Benue-Kwa. So what do we mean by that? That we have cognates between the two. Basically, they are derived from the same original form, both phonologically and also semantically. In terms of the problem, that we have in the African milieu a lack of historical linguistic reconstruction, meaning significant time depth beyond Guthrie's 1967 to 71, 4 volumes, reconstruction of Proto-Bantu. Much of the work on historical linguistics in the African milieu concentrates on classification rather than reconstruction. So we see examples like Greenberg, Bennett, Stark, Blanch, Williamson, and Blanch, so forth. When reconstructions are made, typically mass comparison is used, and examples include Westerman, Mogorowski, obviously not exhaustive. And it's typically, and mass comparison is typically utilized rather than the comparative method. So I'll go into what the differences are between the two. Stewart, however, in several publications up to 2002 uses the comparative method for a pilot Proto-Niger Congo. This is seen as coterminous with what Williamson and Blanch in 2000 referred to as Proto-Benue-Kwa. He refers to it as Proto-Potu Akanektano. So the names can get a bit unwieldy, so just for convenience sake, we use the standard Proto-Benue-Congo, including Proto-Benue-Kwa, including the Benue-Congo languages, of which Yoruba in this case is an example, and the Kwa languages of which Akan is an example in this case. So the study builds on Stewart's work by using the comparative method for reconstruction between Akan and Yoruba, using Yoruba as an intermediate between Akan and Bantu as used by Stewart. And in some of the criticisms of Stewart, he was basically looking for, as I mentioned, a pilot Proto-Niger Congo. And in doing so, he looked mainly at Akan and then Guthrie's reconstruction. We mentioned Guthrie above. Guthrie's reconstruction of Proto-Bantu. So some of the criticisms were saying, oh, he's leapfrogging so many languages in between. Why not look at some of the languages and some of the propositions, most notably by Prof. Dakungu, were that, okay, well, let's look at some of the Bwe languages, let's look at Gadanwe, let's look at these languages. In my case, I look at Yoruba as also representing Benue-Congo, but as an intermediate node in between. So the methodology, we're looking at the comparative method, and the first thing that we do is we identify the putative cognates. So these are the words that look similar both in phonology and semantics. From there, we establish sets of regular sound correspondences. So what I will do is I will show you some of these sets of sound correspondences to start off with. All right, so when we look at Yoruba and Akan, one of the first things that will strike you are the words that look similar, right? But in Yoruba you have the pa, which is the labiovelar, versus Akan you see the pa. This is actually very significant because this is what starts what I posit as the Proto-Benue-Kwa push chain, which is basically you have implosives turning into plain labiovelars, and then from there you have the labiovelars turning into, in this case in Akan, you have just the pa. So we'll show you pa, pa, so forth and so on, and we can continue down so you can see more of these. Here you see Ikwin, the matter in the corner of your eyes, Pi, Queen, Pim, so forth and so on. Here, another one, Okwe, Abe. This is also going to be significant because in this we can find a phonological environment where you have voicing. So you go from Okwe to Abe. So we'll come back to that as well. Akwa versus Aba, as in Nebonabaso, and so forth and so on. Iebo as bark, Abon. And then we also see correspondences between Agbado and Bro, Agbon, Aboji. So basically you're saying the B here becomes just the regular B here. And you find so many of these. Another significant one, we see Iku, Owu, Iko, Owo. And what we're finding here is correspondences between, in this case, just the velar K versus here, the way. So what is going on? This is what we're seeking to do in our historical linguistic analysis, is show what sound changes come to the Akan versus the Yoruba. And in this, we actually found a phonological environment of whenever you have this rounded vowel here, you're going to find this correspondence to the Akan set. We'll continue. And there are so many, but just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, you see a correspondence between the G here and the G here. Ada, Adari, D. So here you see that the D's are across the board. I'm going to come down to, you see Apokor, Apokor, Okan, Ekun. The one I'm looking for is a TS series. Now, okay. This is another regular correspondence. To be enough, so to be enough in Akan. Tek, to spread as in a map versus set as in sekete. Ton, to be finished, asan as in san. So, ton, to light, so. So we're seeing that when you see the T in Yoruba, that regularly you see the S in Chi. And what started off looking at that one is Eta, and san as in bien san. So this is something, when we're seeing this, it's so regular that it can't just be happenstance. So first we know that they're demonstrably related, but what's going on in the phonology? So let's come back to here. All right, so we're going to revisit that again. So once we establish the sets of regular sound correspondences, we identify which sets are in complementary distribution. And this was one of the main contributions of this particular study, is showing that originally Stewart, who I mentioned made this reconstruction, originally for this node that we're referring to as Proto-Benue-Kwa, he reconstructed Kwe, the labial velars. And then later on, he only reconstructed the labialized velars, which are Kwe, Vwe. So he's positing this. What I've done in this study is show that they are allophones. So we identify a specific phonological environment where the Kwe occurs and the phonological environment in which the Kwe occurs. The Kwe is actually a smaller phonological environment, which is behind the which is where you have the rounded vowels, the rounded back vowels. That's where you see the Kwe. All elsewhere you see the Kwe. All right. So once we identify these sets which are in complementary distribution, we identify the regular sound changes, and we'll come to that as well. We identify subsequent cognates. So there are some cognates that right off the bat they will jump at you, but once you identify what the sound changes are, you're able to see others that aren't necessarily obvious. So we see that because the sound change just has pushed, for example, when you have the Kwe, when it becomes just the regular Pe, it brings up the question of, okay, what happens to the P's that were already existing in the language? Either they will merge with these newly created P's, or they will dissimulate to become something else. In this case, you'll see that usually they become fricatives like Fe and things like this, so we'll give you actual examples so you can see it more clearly. But from there, you see other correspondences like the fricative, the labial fricatives like Fe, corresponding with Pe. So there are other things that aren't necessarily obvious, but they come up as by virtue of seeing what the sound changes are. From there, we reconstruct the protophonemes, and then we examine the reconstructed system typologically. So let's continue. Let's go into the differences between mass comparison and the comparative method. So I mentioned that when reconstructions are done, usually they use mass comparison, and as the name implies, you look at so many languages and then you look at how similar they are. Now, some of the challenges are that you may have look-alike words, all right? Another one of the challenges is that it may run the risk of assuming cognacy between similar words when the real explanation is borrowing or aerial diffusion. That there's no guarantee that the similarities are of genuine significance and not simply attributable to chance. However, there are some aspects of mass comparison that are shared with the comparative method. One is that vocabulary is limited to basic vocabulary, usually body parts, primary colors, essential verbs, lower numerals, closed lexical class items, to minimize borrowing effects, all right? The Swadesh list is a good starting point. So this was a list composed by Morris Swadesh, which is just such things like the lower numerals, so forth and so on, body parts, things that typically aren't shared between languages because each language has, everyone has a head or at least a concept of these things to some degree or another. All right, a considerable amount of words are taken into account. So these are features that are shared between mass comparison and the comparative method. The main aspect that's not shared is that in mass comparison, you're looking at a large number of languages at the same time to help in recognizing patterns and identifying cognates that are not readily evident. So mass comparison is looking at so many languages. The comparative method, however, is using mainly 2 languages or 3 languages, and it's doing so in order to see what these minute changes are and to account for the nuances. And basically what you're doing is diachronic phonology. You're looking at how the sound changes on a granular basis, and you're accounting for this sound change so that every time you see this in this language, you're expecting to see this in this other language. So from mass comparison, usually you come up with what are referred to as pseudo-reconstructions. And these differ from true reconstructions from the comparative method, and that it's not possible to derive from them by a set of diachronic rules, their putative reflexes in the daughter languages. All right? And this is a major point. As we mentioned that you look at closed class categories as opposed to open class categories. So these are just some examples. Iwok as you in Yoruba is wolf, you in Akan. Wong, they or them in Yoruba. Wong, they or them in Akan. A me. So these are, fairly, as we're speaking, these are words that typically wouldn't be borrowed between languages. However, there are some exceptions in the world. All right, the methodology, again, examining words with similar meanings in languages assumed as being descended from a common proto-language for discovering regular sound correspondences, reconstructing the proto-language, and also cognates will usually have similarities in both form and meaning. So this is what the comparative method is all about. And also, as I mentioned, establishment of regular sound correspondences. So whenever an unvoiced alveolar stop T occurs as the initial consonant, the C1 in a language X, an unvoiced alveolar fricative C occurs as a C1 in a related language. So that was actually the one that I mentioned that I wanted to point out. So how do we capture this in mass comparison? Typically, it wouldn't necessarily be captured. You would see all of these words have T, and then you'll see all these words have the S, and then they will posit, let's say, a T for the original mother tongue, the mother language from which these are descended. So one of the guidelines to assist us in understanding how the sounds change are implicational laws. And one such is the presence of a less common sound in a language implies that its more common counterpart will also be present. So when we're talking about common sounds, I'll give you examples of common sounds, but this is talking about in the world's language, in the world's languages. So there are a lot of phoneticians who deal with these things so that we can come to see what the common sounds are. Less common sounds have limited usage and distribution in languages that do make use of them as compared with the more common sounds. All right? Also, the use of common sounds is acquired before the use of less common ones, and also less common sounds tend to be less stable than common ones, and are thus more likely to be lost or change over time. This one, we're going to come back to this fourth point, but this is one of the things that we're actually going to see. For Stewart, he reconstructs an implosive series. So you can see languages like the Fula type languages, the Adamawa languages, you can see it in Hausa, that they have this implosive distinction. Well, implosive sounds are less common and they're also less stable. So once we can reconstruct this implosive, we can see how this implosive distinction was lost. And when it was lost, as I mentioned, the sounds that were implosive, they will either converge with the existing non-implosive sounds or they will dissimilate. And basically a dissimilation is for various reasons, but one is semantic. If you have, for example, a word like dog and let's say a hypothetical word like tall, if all the D's become a T, then it would, we can see how there would be semantic, issues. All right, are you talking about a dog now, or are you talking about this tog? All right, so the tog may dissimilate to become sog or something else. This is, of course, all hypothetical. All right, the implicational laws, they're helpful in establishing a relative chronology, also a relative ordering based on precedent of sound change in attested natural languages. As we mentioned, common sounds, that can be an abstract concept, but for example, voiced nasals and liquids are more common than voiceless ones. So voiceless ones are tested in the world perhaps, but voiced nasals, in order to make it, generally they're going to be voiced. Oral vowels are also more common than nasal vowels. So even though they're all, attested, this is what we're referring to in terms of common sounds. Also, consonants of normal length are more common than those with secondary articulations, such as velarization, palatalization, and labialization. The labialization in particular is one that's particularly significant for our case. The most common is a stop or plosive class, and it occurs in all known languages in the world. Fricatives and approximants are less common due to comparatively difficult articulatory gestures required for their production. So if you have a sound where, say for example, you have to put the tip of your tongue all the way back to your velum, this is something, as we're talking about common and uncommon, that would be a very uncommon sound, and it would be difficult just to make in terms of articulation. So in how sound changes work, we would expect for this to be less stable and perhaps move to something that's more goes towards ease of articulation in natural languages. So in the present study, lexical items of Akan and Yoruba are compared in order to establish regular sound correspondences based on the stem initial consonant, the C1, with a primary focus on basic vocabulary. Now, as we're looking at these reconstructions, the C1 is a starting point. That you can also look at the first vowel, the V1, the second vowel in cases where you have longer stems. As we mentioned, that patterns, and as we saw, patterns of correspondences exist wherein a sound X in Akan regularly matches some sound Y in Yoruba. The presumed cognates between Akan and Yoruba can then be correlated with Proto-Bantu. So as we mentioned, Guthrie had a reconstruction of Proto-Bantu. And this is mainly what Stewart himself was looking at. Let's look at the Akan case, and let's look at the Bantu case and see where we see these correspondences. For this particular study, we focused on Akan and Yoruba, but for comparative purposes, we also looked at what Guthrie came up with Proto-Bantu. Our future direction will be to actually select a specific Bantu language and see how these changes occur using the comparative method. But again, that's the future direction. So we looked at his Proto-Bantu and Common Bantu data to add further credence to lexical and sound correspondences proposed. Subsequently, a feasible hypothesis of sound change, including a plausible relative chronology, is developed. And in our case, we look at the Proto-Benue-Kwa push chain, and that was introduced in this study. And where we started with the doubly articulated stops, which have disappeared from most Akan dialects, although they were once widespread amongst the Akan, with Kwe only relatively recently replaced by Pe. One such comparison, so we can see these in demonstrably related Akan or Tano dialects. You see Pa, Ba, Ro, Ko, Ba, Kwe. So we can see that where we're seeing this Pa and Akan, we're seeing this doubly articulated stop, the labial velar here, and the other dialects, as we do in Yoruba. So because of that as the starting point, systematic correspondences between Yoruba Kwe and Akan Be were identified. A similar correspondence between the Yoruba Kwe and Akan Be was also identified, wherein Yoruba had retained the original consonants and Akan had undergone a process of develarization. And again, this is, as I mentioned, the fourth implicational law states that less common sounds tend to be less stable than more common ones, and are thus more likely to be lost or changed over time. So this is when we come to reconstruction, when we see that we have a Be in Yoruba and a Be in Akan, why would we propose a Be for the mother language as opposed to Be? Well, this is going to how we know sound changes work. Will it become more complex? And if it does become more complex, what's the environment in which it becomes more complex? Let's say, all right, if we have an environment, then we can posit the other one. But what we come to is the Be comes to the Be rather than the Be coming to Be. And this is a regular sound change in natural languages. And this goes back to the first implicational law that the presence of a less common sound in a language implies that its more common counterpart will also be present. So if the more common counterpart is present, again, what happens to the more common counterpart when the unstable one comes to encroach on its space? All right, so what happens to the more common counterpart when it shifts? When a sound change occurs, one sound begins to approximate another sound too closely. One of two things happens. Upon changing, the less common sound will either merge with the more common sound, so the Be will either merge with the existing Bes, or, as we see in this case, the more common counterpart will dissimulate from its encroaching neighbor to become another sound, and thus a push chain is born. So this leads to a domino effect. So this Be will become Be. Well, what happens to the Bes? The Bes will then push to something else. All right? We'll actually see examples of this. Also, it is posited that what triggered it off was the loss of the plosive-implosive distinction. And the plosive-implosive distinction is significant for a couple of things. One, it can explain these correspondences and the chain that we're discussing, but also it can account for why in Akan and Yoruba you have te and te. They are both, side by side. So we can see these cognates in both Akan and Yoruba. But you also have the te and then the se. So why would some become or remain te, and why would others become se? Well, when you can have a distinction such as plosives and implosives, then you can see that, okay, not only are you accounting for the Fula data and Hausa and other ones that have this plosive and implosive distinction, all right, but you can also account for why you have this correspondence series here, that the implosives, for example, would have gone to te te, and then the non-implosive would have gone to te se. So you can account for what you're actually seeing as the empirical data here. All right, so as mentioned, that this is the distinction that's retained in the Fula type languages, the Adamawa Eastern languages, and it's, for us, the trigger that started this push chain. So when the implosive became plain, the plain sounds dissimulated in one particular way in Yoruba and another way in Akan. So here you see the we. I'm trying to do an implosive we. It becomes we in Yoruba. However, it becomes pe and be in Akan. So we're seeing the pe. As we mentioned, you can find these phonological environments. So normally it would have become pe everywhere, but the phonological environment we came up with was that intervocalically that you now have voicing that goes on in this particular case. So that was the case in what we showed earlier, the Yoruba okwe, palm tree, versus the Akan ape. So because the a and the bear here, you're having a voicing because of the natural voicing that occurs with vowels. So after the loss of the plain and plosive distinction, Akan completely lost the labial fillers, and those were retained in Yoruba. The main difference between the reconstruction presented in this study and that of Stewart are the reconstructions of kwe, and the star forms indicate that these are putative reconstructions, that we're recognizing them in allophonic distribution. Previously, Stewart reconstructed only the labial velars and later only the labialized velars. But when we can find these specific phonological environments, then we can see that one is an allophone of the other one. So the data from Akan and Yoruba shows that labialized velars occur before high back vowels, while labial velars, also round vowels, while labial velars occur elsewhere. And we can actually extend this. Not only we can find one environment where it's high back round vowels, but we can also find another environment where it's only the back round vowels without the high. And this is where you see examples such as iko as cough in Yoruba versus wap, wo-wap in Akan. All right? All right, let's continue. And as I mentioned, the correspondences between the T in Yoruba and the T in Akan, there's also correspondences between the T and the Akan S. This is accounted for by proposing that one set of consonants is a putative reflex of plain C1, and the other one is attributable to implosive. So this is what I alluded to earlier. This is the original construction, 1983, by Stewart, that has the labial velars, and then 2002, only the labialized velars. But once we identify this, we can see the allophonic distribution here. So this is Kanban 2005. This was my MA thesis, and this is what we're positing here as the phoneme versus the allophone. So to explain the push chain, here you have the implosive labial velar, it becomes kwe here, well, and then it becomes pe and be. Well, that begs the question of, all right, what happens to the pre-existing pe and be? Well, the pre-existing pe, it goes to fe. So basically what you see on the right-hand side in each one, these are the corresponding groups that we see today. Modern day, you can find each one of these. But here, we're reconstructing what the sound changes are that get us to what we see today. All right? And then this is the same for the rotics. So actually, before we get to this, let me actually show you the examples in context so that you can see what we're talking about. All right, so let's look at the implosive labial velars. So we see that the implosive labial velars here, they go to pe and akan. So let's actually look at the examples of what we see today. So you see the implosive labial velars, that you have the similarity in phonological form and also semantic form for each one of these. For the implosive labialized velars, we're seeing that kwe becomes kwe, where you have background tense and high vowel, as we see here. And then later on you have the labialized velar going to only labial. And you see ku to die versus wu and akan to die. You see iku death versus owu death. And then, as I mentioned, the other one where it's not high, you see iko versus wa. And this is the significance of comparing it to Guthrie's Proto-Bantu and Common Bantu, that you can see similar forms in the Bantu languages. All right, so you see ku to die, iku, and this is something that is regularly found. So again, in the future we'll select, you see ko to cough and ko to cough. So that's similar to the Yoruba iko, but the Akan has lost that velarization and has become only the labial. All right. Similarly here, we see the background tense and high, gun to pound, as in to pound, fufu in Yoruba case, gun iyon, which is the pounded yam, versus walk, which is to pound, as in fufu. So these are not, you can't just attribute these to chance. You have gun to stab, and then walk, which is to stab. For here, fa versus po, fa, pa, fa, pa, pe, fe, pe, and so forth and so on. Fi, pum. All right. And we're going to have to, our time is getting short. Wet, right? So we can see, basically, in short, we can see these examples. Let's come back to the slideshow and get to our conclusions. Sorry about that. All right. So our conclusions: that the reconstructions that are most certain are the obstruents across the board. They account for the available data of these cognates that we see today, and they also fit the expected pattern of the push chain of when this one dissimulates from the implosive distinction, that is expected to push this one, is expected to push this one. So all of this is fitting very neatly into our framework, and it even shows us things that we wouldn't have otherwise seen, but because it would be predicted that this would happen, then we go looking for it, and then we actually do see these correspondences. The pattern established by the push chain is such that it even led to the discovery of previously unrecognized recurrent sounds correspondences. And also the firm establishment of this push chain could have implications as vast as that of Grimm's law in the Indo-European English example. But in this case for reconstruction and African historical linguistics. The reconstructions of the sonorants are less certain, as there is no discernible push chain with which to make predictions on based on putative reflexes in Akan and Yoruba. The lack of implosive sonorants in Proto-Benue-Kwa. However, we did find these sound correspondences between Akan and Yoruba for the sonorants, for the nasals, for the liquids as well. So the device that we appealed to in these instances was simply the application of principles of natural sound change and identification of patterns among sonorants. And we also found the extensive identity between the nasals. Our conclusion, our main conclusion, is that there was a loss of the plosive-implosive distinction in Proto-Benue-Kwa. That Stewart, in his article, The Potential of Proto-Akan and Bantu as a Pilot, Proto-Niger Congo, the reconstructions updated, he justifies his reconstruction of the implosives that although the putative cognates across the Fula-type languages and the Potu, Akan, and Bantu languages are very few, 8 Fula entries in Greenberg's Adamawa Eastern Comparative Word List include 2 with voiced implosives. And this is really the crux of the data. And both of these correspond with Proto-Potu-Akanic items with voiced implosives. And there was no plosive implosive distinction in modern day Akan or Yoruba, but it's posited that that loss of the plosive implosive distinction that was retained in the Pula type languages was truly the first trigger that started this push chain that we're positing. After the loss of the plain implosive distinction, Akan completely lost former labial velars, which were however retained in Yoruba. After the loss of the plain implosive distinction, the original Yoruba Kwe was pushed, as was the original Kan Pe. This hypothesis of a plain implosive distinction as lost, leading to the account of a push chain, is able to account for the contemporary data in a clear, pattern, and systematic way. The evidence of allophonic distribution between Kwe and Kwe is evident, and Kwe is evident in the Akan data, and it also shows that round back vowel as the specific environment. The identification of these environments is one of the contributions the study makes to the discourse of Proto-Benue-Kwa Reconstruction, and the establishment of a push chain which accounts for the regular sound correspondences is another significant contribution. In the future, other languages will systematically be brought into comparison. Specifically, we need a specific Bantu language and also a Fula type language with implosives that show these. The recurrent and regular sound correspondences may be identified for each language, for each consonant and vowel of the proto-language to establish sets of diachronic rules, and with the gradual addition of other Delta languages to the work of Proto-Benue-Kwa Reconstruction, the goal of full coverage may be accomplished in the near future to move towards Proto-Niger Congo, which is what Stewart was looking to do, and even beyond.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. And he has demonstrated to you one aspect of linguistics, especially historical or comparative. I'm afraid we are not very strong in that area yet, but that is another area of investigation, looking at languages, comparing forms, and trying to reconstruct what the language looked like maybe many years ago. Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. Now the paper is open for discussion. Dr. Amuzu.
That was a very interesting presentation. I like it. I was wondering, look at your slide 5, what you talked about in the future.
Yes.
I was wondering how your analysis would be if you were to add a bird language, like him.
Yes.
Now, Benue has the double activated sound, bird and bird. And it also has bird, but it doesn't have bird. Alright? And so it's similar in many ways to Yoruba.
Yes.
But it's similar to Akan as well. And so that's where my mind was shifted. We are reconstructing the same proto with bird language too. And that dynamics that we have bird, and bird, but no bird, should be of interest to you to find out what's happening. Whether it fits into your theory or not.
This is of extremely high interest. Professor Dafubu sent me an email this morning, and she actually deals with that because one of the things with Stewart, he didn't find that adding the Ware languages or the Gadangwe languages would significantly change his findings. However, Dafubu, she argues quite convincingly that there are certain things in the Ware languages that can shed light on these reconstructions. This brings up another slightly tangential but actually very relevant point as to the genetic integrity of Kwa as a group. And this is something that has been contested. Like, for example, those scholars like Jack Berry, like Stewart, they were using the comparative method. And even as we're titling it Proto-Benue-Kwa, doesn't necessarily mean that we accept Kwa as a genetic group. That there are other possibilities such as aerial diffusion, such as borrowing, because, well, for several reasons. One are these features that you mentioned that show these affinities toward Yoruba. There's also what we know in oral history, or what's passed down in oral history of migrations, both in the Gwe case, also in the Gadangwe case, and both of those place the Gwe languages, place those languages further east towards the more Yoruba side of things. When we see these other changes that are similar to the Akan, Proto-Tano languages, that generally some of them can be explained by mutual influence or by influence of what happened in the Akan. For me, and this is of course, I can't just answer it because scholars have been working on this for decades and haven't come with a decisive answer. But my inclination is that it seems that originally you deal with these classifications like a tree, with this branch branching from here and this branch, and never the twain shall meet. To deal with that, you have wave theory that posits this as a circle here and then another circle here. You have mutual influences going on here. What my inclination is, and of course I would look for the data from the Gwe languages to support it, would be that yes, initially they did descend from a common node, just like as we're showing demonstrably here, Akan and Yoruba descended from a common node. But let's say the Gwe languages and the Gadangwe languages did come here. When they came back here and converged, this would explain why you do find these correspondences that are similar to the Akan and Yoruba, but you also find the Akan. So they may have already had these cognates by virtue of the fact that they're both descended from the same one, and then they may have other correspondences by virtue of the fact that they are around each other as well. The Yoruba is similar in that you mentioned that they don't have the pe. That Yoruba only has the kwe, but they don't have the pe anymore either. And that's something that's that deserves looking into very significantly, and looking into using the comparative method so we can tease out these nuances and show how the sound changes, if these sound changes happen, how did they affect the other sounds in the language, and how can we account for everything that exists that we can find the cognates for today. So I would definitely, you put out something to the students in your presentation. I would like to put out the same thing for those who speak Hausa, for those who speak the Gwe languages, the Gadangwe languages, that as we can put these in and we can tease out these nuances of the diachronic rules, we can come up with very significant moves towards this Niger-Congo reconstruction. Indo-European is already reconstructed, and that's why you don't hear as much of a push in historical languages, because basically in the West they're like, we're done. But in our case, this is a lot of work that can be done for various reasons. They show this interrelatedness. It also can show how the oral traditions and things, how we can actually show whether or not this is the case or not the case.
Yeah, please go ahead.
But before the question, let me just say that I saw many of the words that are everywhere. Like there is God,
Yes.
who died, and so on. But the second question has to do with, you pick out words that are similar across board and show correspondence. You started off by saying that you pull the words from a field. What I want to know is, you have a database, comprehensive database where you have the similar words as well. Well, I would say that if you're comparing with the pool, everything should be in there. So we know now, percentage-wise, how many of the words are similar and prove the corresponding, which ones are not similar. Now what is happening in the similar one?
Right. This is a very good point. This veers off into lexical statistics. And usually, we start off using the Swadesh list, which is this list of words that are typically not borrowed between languages. And then from this list, and usually you have a 100-word list, as opposed to here, we came up with about 188 words that we are giving as putative cognates between the two. So and that's actually what we started off with was, let's look at these 100 words and let's see where we found the correspondences. When you go into lexical statistics, which is, you can see how they relate. Then you can come up with these same percentages. So from the pool, you start off with the Swadesh list, and we see, okay, there are 33%, similarity between the Akan words that aren't typically borrowed in the world, and then those that aren't typically borrowed. So we started off with that, but that wasn't the goal of our, study. So once we come to those words that we can find these cognates, we also found words that we thought were cognates, but they ended up seemingly to be just lookalikes. Because once we can establish these patterns of sound change, then we can see that, okay, these words look alike, but they're nothing like these. Let's say we have 15 that are very convincing, like the Te and the Se series. Those are very convincing. Let's say we had another one that was Te and say De, and that we just thought that those looked alike, whatever, but they're not fitting into the framework. These 15 are more convincing than this one that we saw here and there. So then those ones that weren't similar, we put those to the side. We keep them in our own database that we have, but we're putting those to the side like, all right, that one, I don't think it overrides what we're looking at here. So the lexical statistics side, that's definitely a field of further inquiry, but it wasn't the specific focus of this. That was the first stage of the process.
Yes. Antoinette? Oh, okay, then Antoinette, then Samson.
Can we conclude that the changes are happening with the C1 of maybe monosyllabic or trisyllabic words? Then what happens to maybe the trisyllabic words into the C1 of the trisyllabic?
Right. For that one, there are a couple of things. One is that you can start off with C1. Others, you can even start off with the C2. You understand? Because one of the claims that's made specifically in this case is that for some of the words, you may have a prefix, like a grammaticalized prefix or something, so that what looks like the C1 isn't actually the C1. So for example, like in Akan you have Omnumkum for cloud, but in Yoruba you find Ikuku for cloud. So alright, do we just throw out the fact that you have this ku here, or do you look at what's the Omunum doing here? Is it part of the word? Is it some type of compounding that's going on here? So we actually found some of them, and this is actually very true for the Rotic series and for the liquids, in general, that usually you wouldn't find the Rotics as the C1, but you will find them as the C2. So in this, you may even posit from that, okay, this that we're finding in front that we're looking at as a C1, it may have, as I mentioned, be a prefix. It may have served some other grammaticalized function that's tagging on, but what was originally the C1 in the past has now moved to a C2 position, for various reasons. So even in our correspondences, these were some of the things that we showed. Even where we can find these correspondences that fit into the pattern of sound change, we even included those as, all right, let's come back and look at those more in depth, because something may be going on with this, what ostensibly is a C1, but may actually not be. It may be a case of compounding, prefix, or other things. So those are included. The main thing that this does is it shows the sound change, and because that's primary, that even trumped the fact that, okay, let's look at the C1. If the sound change is occurring in what looks like the C2, we even included in the data to show that, all right, this sound change is occurring. And that is, for various reasons, but also because if that is in fact just the C2, that can help us in understanding what the sound changes that occur in the C2 actually are.
Yes, Samson?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm a bit curious about the data from Ibaule and then Akan as compared with Yoruba. Ibaule is closer to Akan than Yoruba. And looking at the data with the sound, for instance, I saw one Ibaule seemed to have and Yoruba has. Meanwhile, Akan in between these two languages doesn't seem to have it. So I'm a bit intrigued. How can that be explained? Because assuming sometime in history they were at the same place and they decided to diverge, Akan and Baoli having been closer, I expect that if there will be any loss of sound, if it reaches Akan, it should definitely be better with Baoli. So I don't expect that Baoli will keep the whilst Akan loses it. So I'm a bit intrigued.
This is a very good question. It's noted by Stuart that this loss of this last quid is considered to be relatively recent. So when we're positing for the ancestor language that both of them are descended from, the first thing that happens is this loss of plosive, implosive, and then later on down the line you have in Akan where you have the loss of the doubly articulated stops. So for the other related languages, what we would expect is for some of them to have retained those doubly articulated stops, where Akan has had this innovation of we're getting rid of all of these, stops. So for the closely related languages to have it, and for even the higher ancestor language to have it, this lets us know in terms of the relative chronology, which is what the implicational laws and the comparative method, the relative chronology is showing us that this is something that happens relatively recent. That at the ancestor language, that's, matter of fact, why we reconstruct this quid for the ancestor language, and then show that later on the Akan has lost it, as opposed to the converse of having a pay here and then saying that, oh, these other ones developed it somehow.
Any other question, comment? Well, I want to thank Dr. Campbell once again for this wonderful session. Now, if you want to go into historical or comparative questions, now you have to be good in phonology. It's very important. So those of you in phonology, I had a professor in there who could derive s from k. Yes. From sound. He said, I can do it, and then he would do it. Anyway, so that is it. And as I said, it's another area of then you can even do this. So apart from doing comparative syntax, you can also do comparative linguistics. Next week, let's thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Now, next week, the second year MPhil TESOL students will be presenting their progress of work. So we'll be here next week, 30th, and then the 1st of November. Then the following week, we have another seminar, Anafra in Akan and a comparative study by Samson Kosa and Kofi. So we hope to see you all next week, the following week, and the rest of the time. The schedule is there. Okay, thank you all for coming. Okay, so the seminar is adjourned.
What is that?